The moment my son-in-law's father grabbed my daughter's arm across the dinner table, I felt something go very quiet inside me. Not the angry kind of quiet. The other kind. The kind that means you've already made a decision, and your body just hasn't caught up yet. His name was Aldous Mercer, 64 years old, third-generation money, the kind of man who wore a sport coat to a Sunday dinner at his own house just to remind everyone who owned the furniture. He had a place in Rosedale, one of those old Toronto neighborhoods where the driveways are longer than most people's apartments. And he'd never once let you forget it. My daughter, Ivy, had married his son 2 years earlier. Colin Mercer, 31, worked at his father's asset management firm on Bay Street, had the handshake of a man who'd been coached on handshakes since the age of 7. I never disliked Colin. Not exactly. He was the kind of person you couldn't quite get a read on. Pleasant enough on the surface, but with this habit of looking past you when he talked to you, like he was always checking to see if someone more important had walked into the room. Ivy saw something in him. I suppose I missed. She's always been like that, able to find the warmth in people before they found it in themselves. She's my youngest. After her mother passed, 8 years ago now, it was just the two of us rattling around the house in Oakville. I'm a retired civil engineer. I spent 31 years with the Ministry of Transportation, mostly infrastructure projects, bridges, highway planning, nothing glamorous. We lived a comfortable life, not a Rosedale life, but a good one. The Mercers made it clear from the beginning that they thought Ivy had married well and that I should understand what that meant. Aldous said it once, almost directly, at a Christmas gathering the first year. He said, "You must be relieved she landed somewhere stable." I smiled and said nothing. I found that smiling and saying nothing is almost always the better play. You learn what a person is made of when they think they've gotten away with something. That Sunday dinner was in late October. The leaves were down, the kind of grey afternoon that settles over southern Ontario like a lid on a pot. Aldous had invited us over, me, Ivy, Colin, and Aldous's wife Marguerite, who I had some genuine affection for. She was a quieter woman than her husband, apologetic in the way people become after years of living with someone loud. There was also a business associate of Aldous's there, a man named Fletcher Dowd, that apparently just joined the firm, and whom Aldous seemed to be auditioning for something. Dinner was fine until it wasn't. We were somewhere between the main course and dessert when Ivy mentioned that she'd been approached about a job. She was a landscape architect, good at it, and a firm in Vancouver had reached out. She wasn't saying she'd take it. She was just mentioning it the way you mentioned something at a family dinner. Casually, looking for a reaction, maybe a little curious about what people thought. Aldous set down his wine glass. "You'd uproot Colin's career for a job offer?" Ivy said she was just exploring options. "Colin's partnership track starts in the spring," Aldous said. "You understand what you'd be disrupting." Colin said nothing. He was looking at his plate. I watched Ivy's face do that thing it does when she's trying to keep things smooth, a slight tightening around the eyes, a careful neutrality. She said something diplomatic, something about how it was just an early conversation and nothing was decided. Aldous reached across the corner of the table and grabbed her wrist, not violently, not in the way you described to the police, but firmly, the way a man grabs a wrist when he wants to make sure you understand that the conversation is over. Ivy looked down at his hand. Then she looked up at him. He said, "Good, keep it that way." I stood up. It wasn't a dramatic thing. I just stood up. And Aldous looked at me with this expression that was almost amused, like a man who's watched a house cat puff itself up, and said, "Sit down, Ted. This is a family matter." "She is my family," I said. "Your family," he said, leaning back, "is a guest in this house. Act like it." Fletcher Dowd looked at his water glass. Marguerite looked at her hands. Colin looked at the wall. I sat down. Not because Aldous told me to. I sat down because I'd already done the calculation, and the calculation said that standing in Aldous Mercer's dining room and arguing with him in front of his Bay Street colleague was not going to help Ivy. What was going to help Ivy was something else entirely, something that required me to leave their house calmly, drive back to Oakville, and make a phone call I'd been sitting on for 6 weeks. Let me back up. About 2 months before that dinner, Ivy had called me on a Tuesday evening. She wasn't crying, which with Ivy sometimes means things are worse than if she were. She said that she'd found some documents. She hadn't been snooping. She'd been looking for the home insurance policy, which they kept in a filing cabinet in Colin's home office, and she'd found a folder she didn't recognize. Inside it were account statements, not their joint accounts, accounts she'd never seen, numbered accounts, and some correspondence with a numbered company registered in the Cayman Islands. I told her not to touch anything, to put the folder back exactly as she found it, and to come to Oakville that weekend. Now I need to explain something about myself, because it matters for what comes next. Before I worked for the Ministry of Transportation, I spent 6 years in the late 80s working for a forensic accounting firm in Ottawa. I wasn't an accountant. I was brought on for infrastructure assessment, looking at capital project bids for signs of bid rigging and contractor fraud. It was niche work, and I was never the sharpest mind in the room. But I learned enough to understand what financial misconduct looks like when it's trying to hide. I learned who to call when you find it. One of the people I worked alongside in Ottawa was a woman named Constance Bellemare. She went on to become one of the senior investigators at the Financial Transactions and Reports Analysis Centre of Canada, FINDRAC, if you know it. And after she retired from there, she consulted for the Ontario Securities Commission. We'd stayed in touch the way you stay in touch with people from old jobs. The occasional email, a card at Christmas, a phone call when something reminded you of a shared story. She knew me. She knew I wasn't someone who called with nonsense. When Ivy came to Oakville that weekend, she described what she'd seen in as much detail as she could remember. Account numbers, dates, the name of a Cayman holding company. I wrote it all down. I told her I needed a few weeks before I did anything, and I needed her to behave completely normally in the meantime. No confrontations, no questions to Colin, nothing that would make anyone feel watched. She asked me what I was going to do. I told her I was going to make a phone call to someone who would know whether what she'd found was worth worrying about. What I didn't tell her, because I didn't want her to carry it, was that I had already started to piece things together before she'd even called me. 3 weeks earlier, Colin had mentioned over dinner that his firm was restructuring some client portfolios. He'd said it the way people mention things they hope will pass without comment, but I'd caught something in the phrasing, the word restructuring, used in a context where reallocation was the right word. Small thing. But I'd filed it. I also knew from something Marguerite had said in passing months before that Aldous had been under some pressure from an investor group that was asking questions about returns on a commercial real estate fund. She'd mentioned it the way wives mention things they probably shouldn't, quietly, between other topics, and then moved on quickly like she regretted saying it. I called Constance on a Thursday morning in early September. I kept the call short and factual. I told her my daughter had come across some documents that suggested her husband and possibly his father's firm were running undisclosed accounts connected to an offshore entity. I told her the name of the firm, Mercer Capital Partners, registered in Ontario. I told her I wasn't looking to blow anything up. I just wanted to know if what I was describing lined up with anything she might be aware of, or if I was seeing ghosts. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Ted, how confident are you in what your daughter remembered?" I said, "Fairly confident." She said, "Can you send me what you have in writing?" I sent her an email that evening. I kept it to 2 paragraphs and 3 bullet points. I asked her to treat it as background only, and to let me know if it warranted anything further. That was 6 weeks before the Sunday dinner. I drove home from Rosedale that evening with the radio off. Ivy had texted me from the car. She and Colin were driving separately, and all she said was, "You okay?" I texted back, "Yes, don't worry." Which wasn't entirely true, but was close enough. When I got home, I called Constance. She picked up on the second ring, which told me she'd been expecting the call might come. "The file is open," she said. "It's been open for about 3 weeks. I can't tell you more than that." I asked if my daughter was at any risk. "Not from what we know," she said, "but she should probably talk to a family lawyer, someone she trusts, not connected to the Mercer firm in any way." I thanked her and hung up. I sat in my kitchen for a while after that. There was a cup of tea I'd made and forgotten about, gone cold on the counter. Outside, the street was quiet, the way Oakville gets quiet on Sunday evenings, a kind of settled stillness, like the neighborhood has exhaled. I thought about Ivy's face when Aldous grabbed her wrist. That particular stillness. I recognized it. Her mother used to get that look when she was processing something painful, but refusing to let it find her face. The two of them were alike in ways that still catch me off guard sometimes. I called Ivy at 9 o'clock. I told her to find a family lawyer on her own, not through any recommendation from Colin or his firm. I gave her the name of a woman in Mississauga I'd worked with briefly on a ministry legal matter years ago, who I knew to be straightforward and good. I told Ivy to call her on Monday and to say her father had referred her. Ivy asked me if something was happening. I said, "Something might be happening, yes." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How long have you known?" I told her a few weeks. I told her I hadn't said anything because I didn't want to worry her until there was something to be worried about. She said, "Dad, that's exactly when you should have told me." She was right. I told her so. It's a habit of mine, managing information, holding things close until they're resolved, that she has pointed out before and that I have not fully corrected. I'm working on it. The next 4 months are not entirely mine to tell. What I can say is this. The Ontario Securities Commission opened a formal investigation into Mercer Capital Partners in January. The investigation related to undisclosed related party transactions, a commercial real estate fund where investor returns had been manipulated through a Cayman-registered intermediary, and the improper use of client funds to cover losses in a separate internal account. Aldous Mercer was named as the primary respondent. Colin, as a registered dealing representative at the firm, was named as a secondary respondent. FinTrack had already submitted a suspicious transaction report to the OSC the previous autumn. I don't know when exactly, or what triggered it independently of my call to Constance. It's possible the OSC was already circling the firm and my information was merely corroborating. Constance, to her credit, has never been specific about what role my call played. She's not that kind of person. Ivy served Colin with separation papers in February. She had been to see the lawyer in Mississauga 3 times by then, had her own sense of what she wanted, and made the decision herself. I didn't push her and I didn't hold her back. I drove her to the appointment and waited in the parking lot with a coffee and a book. I wasn't really reading. Colin did not fight the separation. His lawyer, I'm told, advised him to keep things quiet given the circumstances. The Vancouver job offer, which had been the small spark that set the whole Sunday dinner on fire, came through again in the spring. The firm in Vancouver had followed up. Ivy called me on a Thursday evening to tell me she'd accepted it. I said, "Good." She said, "Will you come visit?" I said, "Of course I'll come visit. Give me a weekend to clear the calendar." She laughed. It was the first time in months that I'd heard her laugh without something careful underneath it. The OSC proceedings against Aldous Mercer are a matter of public record now. He faced a hearing before the Capital Markets Tribunal in the spring. The allegations involve roughly $2.3 million in undisclosed transfers over a 4-year period. His firm's registration was suspended pending the outcome. Colin, who cooperated with investigators and provided a voluntary statement, received a lesser designation, a reprimand and a 2-year prohibition from acting as a dealing representative. Whether that reflects the full extent of his involvement, I genuinely don't know. That's for the process to determine, not me. Marguerite called me once during all of it. Just once. She called from a number I didn't recognize. Her cell, I think, not the home line, on a Tuesday afternoon in March. She said she was sorry for what had happened at that dinner in October. She said she'd been sorry for a long time before that. I told her I appreciated the call. I meant it. She's a decent woman who made a long series of accommodations that most people would have made too, and I don't have any grievance with her. We said goodbye and I don't expect I'll hear from her again. Aldous Mercer, I understand, contested the proceedings. He retained a very expensive lawyer, and I'm sure the process will be long and not entirely satisfying in the way people imagine justice to be. That's fine. I've been around long enough to know that outcomes in these things are measured in restrictions and fines and professional consequences, not in the dramatic reversals people hope for. The dramatic reversal was watching Ivy call me from her new apartment in Vancouver 2 weeks after she moved, to tell me she'd taken a long walk along the seawall and felt, for the first time in years, like herself. That was enough for me. I've thought about that Sunday dinner many times since, about what I might have said differently, about whether I should have moved sooner or spoken up louder. about Aldous' face when I stood up. That flicker of amusement, the certainty that I was nothing he needed to take seriously. What I keep coming back to is this: I didn't do anything heroic. I made a phone call to an old colleague, and I sent an email with bullet points. I drove my daughter to a parking lot and waited with a cold coffee. I'm a retired engineer from Oakville. I understand drainage patterns and load-bearing specifications and the particular way Ontario clay behaves under a highway in spring thaw. I am not a remarkable person, but I have spent 63 years watching what happens when people stay quiet to keep the peace, and I have learned that the peace they're keeping is usually only peaceful for one party. When Aldous grabbed Ivy's wrist, he was counting on everyone at that table doing what they'd always done. Looking away, looking at their hands, looking at the wall. He'd built an entire life on that assumption. He just didn't know who he was sitting across from. And I didn't need him to. I keep a notepad on my kitchen counter. Nothing fancy. A yellow legal pad, the kind you buy in a pack of 3 at Staples. I've kept one there for years. A habit left over from the ministry days when I learned that writing things down was the difference between remembering something correctly and remembering something the way you wished it had gone. The night Ivy called me about the documents she found in that filing cabinet, I picked up the pen before she'd finished the second sentence. Not because I was calm, because I understood, somewhere underneath the worry, that what she was describing was the kind of thing that required accuracy more than it required emotion. That's something I've come to believe about the harder moments in life. The ones that matter, the ones where someone you love is being hurt, don't reward panic. They reward clarity. Aldous Mercer had spent decades learning to read a room and identify who he could dismiss. He looked at me across his dining table in Rosedale and saw a retired civil servant from Oakville in a sport coat that wasn't quite the right cut. He made a calculation. The calculation was wrong, but it wasn't unreasonable. He just didn't have all the information. What he didn't know was that I'd been quietly collecting it. I'm not a brave man in any dramatic sense. I didn't confront him. I didn't raise my voice. I sat back down, finished dinner, drove home in the dark, and called someone I'd worked alongside 30 years ago. What I did have, and what I think matters more than courage in most situations, was the patience to understand that the right action taken at the right moment is worth 10 wrong actions taken at 10 wrong moments. That's not wisdom I was born with. I learned it slowly, from work that required me to read documents for signs of things that didn't want to be found. Ivy made her own decisions throughout all of this. That matters to me more than anything else in the story. I gave her information. I gave her a lawyer's name. I drove her to a parking lot and waited, but she was the one who walked into that office, asked the right questions, and eventually packed her apartment into a moving truck and started again in Vancouver. That took something I can only describe as a quiet kind of toughness, the sort that doesn't announce itself, that just keeps showing up on the mornings when showing up is the hardest thing. I think about the 3 things that actually move the needle in all of this. It wasn't rage, and it wasn't luck. It was knowing the difference between right and wrong clearly enough to act on it without needing permission. It was understanding enough about how certain systems work to know who to call and what to say. And it was the willingness to stay the course over months, without shortcuts, without the satisfaction of confrontation, trusting that the process would eventually do what it was built to do. Those 3 things, a moral compass you actually use, the knowledge to back it up, and the steadiness to see it through, are the only tools that actually held up when everything else was uncertain. The legal pad is still on my counter. Most days there's nothing on it, but it's there.